What is your opinions of the pastors going against quarantine requirements and continuing to hold large services? Well, I mean, I'm in Texas. What's really interesting is in Texas, the executive order that the governor gave said that churches are essential, but if you can do alternatives, they strongly suggested you did. And so I don't know that churches in Texas would actually be in some kind of trouble for holding a meeting, not legally. I mean, I don't think we'd be in violation necessarily. It's a little vague in Texas. However, since I am, Texan, I'm just, all about that, rugged individual liberty. Hey, government, get out of my business. So,
can I ask a follow-up because I'm really not clear. What did they by a pastor going against quarantine requirements, or is it a pastor that's having their parishioners drive up in a car and having like a drive-through movie where he's standing up preaching and they're in a car? Is that going against quarantine requirements? Is it having a service and not doing it online? Or, I mean, I'm truly ignorant to what the quarantine requirements are.
I think there's some examples of some, especially some larger churches that are like quarantine, schmorantine, we're still going to have service and everyone's coming into the building and they're just business as usual.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that is what it's referring to. We have had instances in some places where even the drive-in churches, like the drive-up, still in your cars churches, the police have tried to shut those down, which I don't get. But, I mean, me personally, I understand, like we chose not to meet. Liberty Hill, I mean, I sat down, I looked at the order, and I said, you know what? Technically, we can still meet. But, we have a lot of elderly people in the congregation. Most everyone was already self-quarantining anyway. We can do live stream. Hey, you know what? Let's just go ahead and do the full online experience. But I'm not going to talk down about people who said, you know what? I need my family. I need my brothers and sisters to come together and worship, and we're going to be careful and not, shake hands and, hug all over each other. Fine. But, we'll still meet. And I see both arguments, and the, liberty loving American in me wants to say, hey, whatever, you do you.
Yeah.
Okay. The question was new to me, and I interpreted it as in meeting in the building and still gathering during the quarantine. And then I went down a different road. How many pastors have died? And this one's all brand new to me, but evidently several pastors have died after having large gatherings. Again, they go back to your statement earlier tonight that these are in highly populated areas where all the outbreaks are concentrated. So those churches that met in public places and in clusters close together, several members and their parishioners all got sick, and then a lot of ministers. And so that one's new to me. I had not seen that report. And so I've got a lot of reading to do tonight. So I don't like the fact that you get arrested or getting a ticket for having a church service in your car in your parking lot. That one makes no sense. Now, if a policeman comes in here and says, David, you're under arrest because you're too close to Mark, and I'm like, I'm next to guys all day at work this close. Some of us wear masks, some of us don't. But we practice social distancing everywhere. And I told Mark yesterday, I was at Lowe's. There were 500 people there. That parking lot was full. And there's someone at the door counting them as you come in, and some at the other counting as you come out. Everywhere on the floor, if you're in line, 6 feet, stay away. I get some of that. This church is big enough that you could have people in it and not be close to each other. So I think if you wanted to have church in the building, you could. If people didn't want to come, because they're still nervous, hey, I'm in agreement with that. Because we can't distinguish right now how much is real and how much is fake. I do know that as a minister, we need to minister to our people. Whether we're doing it through the internet, phone calls, or whatever, go stand on the porch and talk to them through the screen door, I guess. I don't know.
One thing I'll say, like you guys talk, is I've tried to stay away from language as referring to church shutting down or church being canceled. I've tried to describe it in terms of church adapting, right? That what we've done at Liberty Hill is we've adapted to the circumstances, but still, ministering and holding service. We're just meeting in a different way. But for those who are like, you know what, no, we want to be in person. I have a hard time saying no and looking down on them. It may not be wise, but I don't know I'm going to gripe at them for it. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in California. Our stay-at-home churches are not essential, so the order applies to church services. So any gathering more than 5 people, so we are not permitted to gather. In that case, I think the decision is clear because I think that I am given a clear command in Romans and other places that we ought to obey just civil law. This is, if this was some type of persecution of the church, then we would have warrant, I think, for civil disobedience. But because this is an act of quarantine to try to, it's stores, it's not targeted at churches, it's not targeted at Christians, it's targeted at everything shuts down. That I think that we have that we actually have an obligation in Scripture to comply with those types of orders. And the way that our church is viewing it is basically we're doing church like if we were sojourners. If you're a sojourner and you're traveling, you might not always have back in the day, you might not always have a church that you get to go to. You make do with what you have. And we praise God that we live in a time where we can have remote services and things like that. I think, Mark, I do agree with you though that there is a certain kind of level of conscience here that I wouldn't necessarily want to bind someone's conscience on and say, oh, you're sinning. But I do agree that it's probably not the wisest thing in most contexts. I think it's really not the wisest things in other contexts. My church is probably 75-80% senior citizen. It is really it is a heavy at-risk population. It is really not wise for us elders to do visitations from house to house, right? Because we could just be carrying it from place to place. So I think there are other things to take in mind. I'm not sure it's cookie cutter, but I think in this type of situation where it's potentially, hopefully a very temporary thing, that it would be that it's just more wise and prudent to err on the side of caution. So,
Patrick, anything to add?
Well, I think the question on what do I think of pastors that do that? My question back to those pastors would be, are you doing the most loving thing towards your congregation? I think the number one, not the number one maybe, but a pretty high rule of thumb, at least when I was a pastor, was, am I doing the most loving thing towards my congregation? And in today's world of technology, Zoom, YouTube, Facebook Live, all this, I think if you're meeting in person just to snub your hand at the government and be like, we're a church, we're going to do this, I don't think that's even in the right heart to gather to worship God in. If this was China and we were getting persecuted in the underground church, that's a totally different situation. I don't think that's what's happening here. If it turns into that, you know me, Mark, personally, I'd be the first one on there, but I don't see anything wrong with pastors telling their congregations to sit at home There's no reason to do not to do these. Take advantage of technology. If anything, I hope that it's opened our eyes up to how the church can use technology to further the gospel. And so, what I think of those pastors, my question back to them could only be: are you doing the most loving thing towards your congregation? What's your motive for meeting? And I have to hear them out. I can't really say what my opinion is of them. I will say this, coming out of this coronavirus, and I've thought about this quite a lot, is my fear for the church overall is that we are letting the fear of death overrule our lives of faithfulness. And I don't want us to go down that road. I don't want us to be so afraid of dying that we never take a risk for the gospel. Now, I don't think that's the case in the coronavirus. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I hope that this doesn't breed an overly cautious, like, we don't want to step out there where there could be some danger because we might die type thing. And that might be taking a stretch. I might be taking a stretch there, but I worry that we're letting the fear of, that we could potentially let the fear of death rule our actions over the fear of faith, over our steps of faith. Because, the church historically, before we had hospitals, thank God we have hospitals, we would be on the front lines. Like, we would be going to those corona people, and this would be a totally different conversation. We would be prodding one another, go serve them, go be with them, go help them. We're not in that situation now, though, and I think the prudent thing would be to take advantage of technology. This is free for the most part. I think, like, I got a Zoom subscription for, I think, $14 or something. I mean, I think. But my question to answer the question more directly I would have to ask that pastor. Are you doing the most loving thing towards your congregation? What's your motivation behind meeting? And that's why I'd leave that.
Yeah, I really agree with that. You're absolutely right. Historically, I mean, we know during the Black Plague, during the Black Death, pastors died at ministers, whether priests or pastors, whatever it was, died at a rate about 45% higher than the average layman. Because they were going and ministering to the sick, and they were administering last rites in the Catholic tradition, and they were going and saying prayers of the families in Protestant traditions, and those types of things. There's a really helpful quote. I won't read it. I posted it, and Marc, you can get it on my wall if you want to. But Luther basically goes through and he says, "Look, if you're one of those people, that's saying, hey, like, we can do whatever we want because God's going to protect us." Stop being, in Luther, he says it more rarely, but basically stop being an idiot. Like, God works through means. God works through wise people doing wise things. Now, to your point, that's exactly right. If there's a gospel ministry that has to take place, if one of our congregation is passing away, I would go and try to, in California, I'm not even allowed to. You can't visit. Spouses can't even visit when people are passing away in hospitals or giving birth or anything like that. But if I have to go and visit someone and do some gospel ministry, then yeah, I'll do that. But I'm probably gonna wear a mask, and I'm gonna wash my hands, and I'm gonna wear gloves, and I'm gonna take the precautions. But we can do all that and still do gospel ministry. But if they're out there just saying like, hey, we don't need any of that, we can just meet and do whatever we want because God will protect us. I mean, that's just a deeply unbiblical way to do life anyways. I don't find that a very biblical path towards wisdom where God has said, get wisdom, be wise in the situations that you are in. That doesn't mean, again, you don't have faith. It doesn't mean you don't step out on faith and act in trust and obedience to his will and his work, but just don't be dumb.
Okay. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I want to add on what he just said. When I was chaplain at the hospital, certain patients, you did. You would glove up, gown up, and you would go the extra mile because they can't afford your germs.
That's right.
So you're right. We do need to be smart. And there's only a few Christians that I know that won't take an aspirin.
Yep.
So we take medical advice all the time. And it makes sense. Protect ourselves. It makes sense to be cautious. What I just read in several of these articles doesn't make sense. Some of these pastors would have these large group meetings, and now their people are sick. But then again, you read the bottom of the article, they confess that not everybody originally died of COVID. They died of cancer issues, but got labeled COVID. And so it's going to take a while to sift through those articles and figure out how much and how many people truly died from those congregations of the illness. But I still agree with being cautious. I mean, we don't know how bad this is, and though it's not hitting our area, it's hitting other areas pretty hard, just like the flu is. But we've all admitted that we got sick, 6 weeks ago, all of us, for some unknown reason. Was it the flu? Was it normal sinus infections? But it ravaged our work, and then suddenly everyone says it's COVID. I don't know. I don't have that answer.
Yeah,
but I like what you said, Patrick. What's our motive?
I think sometimes too, what you're getting at is the motive can also be too nearsighted, where it's thinking of, well, I'm not worried about me getting sick, or I'm not worried about the people in the building getting sick. But if we're understanding this as a pandemic and what's happening, if I've now just shared a space with 500 people, and then I go to the grocery store, I'm now potentially passing it to people they're involuntary in this situation. I think of the Jeremiah passage where Jeremiah was encouraging them. You're going to be in these foreign cities. Work for the good of the city. Pray for the good of the city. You're going to be in exile, but you should be seeking the benefit and the good of the city and the place that you're in. That's part of what it means to be an ambassador for Christ. And I think that part of that is going to go and say, okay, well, I need to not only worry about the implications that it has on my Sunday. And if I'm worried about, to be frank, I'm not worried about it. I'm 39 years old. I'm getting at the point where statistically I might be at risk, but I'm pretty healthy. My wife is younger. My kids are young. They're like, statistically, we are not going to be the people that are probably even going to be symptomatic of it if we get it. I'm just not that worried about it. But I also recognize that I have elderly parents, and I go to the grocery store and I touch things, and I work with people who are elderly, and there are other people in this world besides myself that I should be worried about in the same way that I'm worried about their soul and their eternal destination. Why can I not make decisions to try to do the good for their body and their life as well?